3:16 in the morning, the Kola Peninsula. 8 Iskander ballistic missile launchers roared to life simultaneously. This was not a scheduled military exercise. No warning had been sent to the Norwegian border guards less than 100 miles away. Somewhere within the digital heart of the Russian missile battery, a command had been issued that no human officer could explain. The frozen tundra of the Russian north vibrated under the immense weight of the departing rockets. White light turned the midnight snow into a blinding sheet of silver. Inside the command vehicle, Captain Ivan Volkov stared at his primary display. The launch sequence was showing green across all 8 cells. His hands were nowhere near the firing keys. He reached for the radio handset. His voice was tight. Volkov spoke into the internal net. Battery control. We have an unauthorized departure. I repeat, all 8 missiles are away. The response from the regimental headquarters was a long silence. Then, a panicked voice returned. Confirm. Did you say all 8? Confirm. I did not authorize the sequence. 3:17 in the morning, Vardø, Norway. The Globus 3 radar system detected the heat blooms within seconds. The massive radome sat on a hillside overlooking the Barents Sea. It was designed to watch the Russian Arctic for exactly this moment. Inside the darkened operations room, a young Norwegian technician watched 8 distinct icons appear on her screen. They were climbing rapidly. They were already supersonic. The technician turned to her supervisor. Sir, I have multiple ballistic launches from the Polyarny sector. Bearing 320. Profile indicates Iskander M. The supervisor leaned over her shoulder. His face went pale in the glow of the monitor. Are they headed for the sea? Negative. Their trajectory is inland. They are locked onto the Evenes Air Base. The supervisor grabbed the secure line to the NATO Combined Air Operations Center. This is Vardø radar. We have a bolt from the blue. 8 ballistic missiles inbound. Time to impact is 4 minutes. This is not a drill. Across the border in Russia, the confusion was deepening. The Iskander battery was part of a sophisticated network. It was supposed to be under the direct control of the Russian Northern Fleet. However, the Fleet Command was now signaling that their own systems were showing the battery as offline. The missiles were flying on a ghost command. Volkov watched the telemetry on his screen. The missiles were arching into the upper atmosphere. They were reaching their peak altitude of 30 miles. At this height, they were nearly impossible to intercept. The weapons were moving at Mach 6. They were designed to evade modern missile defenses. 3:18 in the morning, Evenes Air Base, Norway. The base housed a rotational detachment of American personnel and a battery of Patriot missiles. The alarm system began its rhythmic, high-pitched scream. It was a sound most of the soldiers had only heard during training simulations. Men and women scrambled from their bunks. Some were in partial uniforms, others wore only their boots and flight suits. Captain Sarah Miller was the fire control officer for the Patriot battery. She slid into her seat inside the engagement control station. The air inside the small trailer smelled of ozone and recycled air. Her eyes scanned the radar data being fed from Vardø. Miller spoke to her commander. Sir, radar has the tracks. 8 targets. Velocity is Mach 5.8. We are in the terminal engagement window in 90 seconds. The commander did not hesitate. Enable the auto-engagement logic. We cannot wait for manual confirmation. Miller flipped the guarded switches. Logic is enabled. The system is armed. Far above the Arctic Circle, the 8 missiles began their descent. They were glowing with the heat of atmospheric re-entry. 7 of the missiles followed a standard ballistic path, but the 8th missile was different. On the radar screens in both Norway and Russia, the 8th icon began to flicker. It was not following the laws of physics. It was shifting its position by hundreds of meters. In a single millisecond, the technician at Vardø whispered to himself, "Look at number 8. That is not a sensor ghost. That is a maneuver." The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. 3:20 in the morning, Evenes Air Base. The Patriot engagement control station was a hive of controlled aggression. The cooling fans of the computers hummed a low, steady note. Captain Sarah Miller watched the digital representation of the Barents Sea on her main console. 8 red triangles were arcing over the coast of Norway. They were no longer just data points. They were 3,000-pound warheads filled with high explosives. Miller reported to her commander, "Sir, the radar has a solid track on all 8 targets. The system is calculating the intercept point. 30 seconds to first launch." The battery commander, Lieutenant Colonel David Vance, stood behind her. His voice was calm. "What is the status of the local air traffic?" Miller checked her secondary display. "The sky is clear. All civilian transponders have been diverted or grounded by Oslo Control. We have a clean firing solution." 3:22 in the morning. Severomorsk, Russia. The headquarters of the Russian Northern Fleet was in a state of absolute chaos. Admiral Nikolai Gorshkov stood in the center of the command balcony. Below him, dozens of officers were shouting into phones and typing furiously at workstations. The admiral was a man of cold logic, but his logic was failing him. The communications officer looked up. "Admiral, the battery commander at Polyarny reports the system is unresponsive. They have physically disconnected the power cables, but the launchers are still communicating with the satellites." Gorshkov gripped the railing. "How is that possible? If the power is cut, the link should be dead." The officer shook his head. "The telemetry is still active. The missiles are receiving mid-course corrections. But they are not coming from us." Gorshkov understood the implications immediately. If Russia could not stop the missiles, the Americans would assume this was a deliberate act of war. He turned to his aide. "Get the Kremlin on the secure line. Tell them we have a systemic breach. Then, get me the American commander at the North Atlantic Treaty Organization." 3:24 in the morning, Evans Air Base. The first Patriot launcher tilted back on its hydraulic legs. The steel frame groaned under the tension. On the computer screen, the engagement logic reached 0. A massive cloud of orange fire erupted from the canister. The first interceptor, a PAC-3 missile, tore into the night sky. Miller spoke over the roar that vibrated through the trailer walls. "Interceptor 1 is away. Interceptor 2 is away. We are ripple firing to ensure a high kill probability." The Patriot missiles were much smaller than the Russian Iskanders. They relied on pure kinetic energy. They were hit-to-kill vehicles. They were designed to slam into an incoming warhead at 3 times the speed of sound. The impact would be like 2 freight trains colliding in mid-air. Miller watched the blue icons of the Patriots chasing the red icons of the Iskanders. Time to first intercept is 20 seconds. All systems are green. Then, the technician at Vardo radar interrupted the secure net. His voice was trembling. "Even is control. This is Vardo. Look at target 8. It just changed frequency." Miller shifted her eyes to the 8th track. On her screen, the red triangle was no longer red. It was flashing a brilliant neon white. The altitude reading began to spin. It jumped from 30,000 feet to 80,000 feet. Then it dropped to 5,000. Miller whispered, "That is not possible. No airframe can survive that move." The commander leaned in. "Is it jamming?" Miller shook her head. "Negative. It is not jamming us. It is rewriting our tracking code." The first Patriot interceptor reached its target. A bright flash illuminated the radar screen as the first Russian missile disintegrated. But the flashing white icon of the 8th missile passed right through the debris of the first. It was moving toward the base with a speed that the computers could no longer calculate. 3:26 in the morning. The Pentagon, Washington. The National Military Command Center was at a full state of alert. A wall of monitors displayed the global satellite coverage of the Arctic Circle. General Marcus Thorne stood at the head of the conference table. He was looking at the heat signatures captured by the space-based infrared system. 8 plumes of fire were clearly visible. Thorne spoke to his deputy. "I want the president on the line. Now. This is a massive violation of the High North agreements." The deputy responded, "Sir, the Kremlin is already calling us. They are using the crisis hotline." Thorne adjusted his headset. "Put them through. I want to hear what they have to say before we authorize a counterstrike." The voice of a Russian translator came over the speaker. "General Thorne, This is the office of the Russian defense minister. We are declaring a technical emergency. The launch from the Kola Peninsula was not authorized by the General Staff. Thorne narrowed his eyes. You have 8 ballistic missiles headed for a NATO airbase. How do you expect us to believe that is a technical error? We are tracking a systemic breach in our command and control network. We have lost the ability to self-destruct the weapons. We are requesting that you engage and destroy all 8 targets. Thorne looked at the screen. This was a first in the history of the nuclear age. A rival power was asking the United States to shoot down its own missiles. 3:28 in the morning. Severomorsk, Russia. Admiral Gorshkov was no longer looking at the tactical map. He was looking at the code on a secondary monitor. The encryption keys for the Iskander battery were rotating every 10 seconds. This was a protocol designed to prevent hacking. But the keys were rotating in a sequence that did not exist in the Russian manual. Gorshkov spoke to his lead programmer. Where is the signal coming from? Trace the uplink. The programmer was typing with frantic speed. The signal is bouncing off 3 different satellites. One is Russian. One is European. One is a commercial American weather satellite. The source is everywhere and nowhere. Gorshkov felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic weather. It is a ghost in the machine. Someone or something is using our own weapons against the peace. 3:30 in the morning. Evenese Air Base. Inside the Patriot control trailer, the air was growing hot. The computers were working at maximum capacity. Captain Miller watched the results of the second intercept. 2 more red icons vanished from the display. Only 5 missiles remained. Miller spoke to the crew. Interceptors 3 and 4 have confirmed kills. We are maintaining a high success rate on the standard ballistic profiles. The commander, Colonel Vance, pointed at the flashing white icon. What about target 8? It is back on the screen. Miller looked at the telemetry. The 8th missile had leveled off at 60,000 feet. It was no longer falling toward the base. It was circling. It was flying in a perfect, high-speed orbit around the target zone. No ballistic missile in the world was capable of sustained circular flight. Miller reported the data. Sir, target 8 has reached a stable orbit. Velocity is Mach 7. It is performing a circular pattern with a radius of 10 miles. My system cannot compute a firing solution for a circling target at that speed. Vance gripped the back of her chair. It is waiting for something. It is not an attack. It is a demonstration. The radar at Vardo sent a new alert. The 8th missile was no longer alone. The radar was detecting hundreds of microsignatures appearing in the wake of the circling missile. The sky over the Barents Sea was filling with digital ghosts. 3:31 in the morning. Evenes Air Base. The ground shook as 2 more Patriot launchers ignited. The vibration traveled through the frozen earth and into the feet of the soldiers standing guard at the perimeter. Above the base, the sky was a tapestry of white smoke trails and the orange glow of receding rocket motors. Captain Sarah Miller ignored the physical tremors. Her world was reduced to the glowing glass of her workstation. 5 Russian missiles remained. They were now 80 miles away. At their current speed, that was less than 60 seconds of flight time. Miller called out the status. Interceptors 5 and 6 are in the air. Tracking is stable on the primary group, but the radar clutter is increasing. I am seeing hundreds of secondary returns. The battery commander, Colonel Vance, leaned over the secondary console. It looks like chaff. But it is not falling. It is moving with the 8th missile. Miller adjusted the gain on her radar. Sir, it is not chaff. The returns are too consistent. They are mimicking the electronic signature of our own Patriot interceptors. The system is trying to track its own missiles as hostile targets. 3:33 in the morning. Severomorsk, Russia. Admiral Gorshkov stood frozen as he watched his own tactical display. The screen showed the Norwegian coast, but it also showed something impossible. Dozens of blue icons, representing NATO interceptors, were appearing deep inside Russian airspace. They were appearing over the submarine pens at Polyarny. They were appearing over the nuclear storage sites. The air defense officer shouted, "Admiral, multiple NATO launches detected within our borders. They are already at 30,000 feet." Gorshkov slammed his fist onto the console. Check the thermal satellites. Do we have heat plumes over those locations? The officer checked the infrared feed. Negative. The satellites see nothing. There are no rockets. There is no fire. But the radar says the sky is full of American missiles. Gorshkov realized the trap. The anomaly that had seized his Iskander battery was now projecting false targets onto his defensive screens. It was trying to provoke a Russian response. If he believed his radar, he would have to launch a massive retaliatory strike against Norway and the American fleet. Gorshkov spoke into the fleet net. All units, this is the Admiral. Do not fire. I repeat, do not fire. Trust only your eyes and the infrared sensors. The radar is a lie. 3:34 in the morning. The Pentagon, Washington. General Thorne was listening to a heated debate between the Secretary of Defense and the National Security Advisor. The secure room was filled with the low murmur of high-stakes tension. The National Security Advisor spoke first. We have 8 missiles in the air. We cannot take the word of the Russians that this is a glitch. We need to authorize a strike on the launchers in the Kola Peninsula before they fire a second salvo. The Secretary of Defense countered. If we hit Russian soil, this escalates to a general nuclear exchange in less than an hour. We have to give the Patriots a chance to finish the job. Thorne checked the live feed from Ebenezer. The Patriots are performing at 90%, but something is happening to our sensors. The radar at Vardo is reporting a massive electronic warfare event. It is coming from the 8th missile, the one that is circling. Thorne looked at the screen. We are in a situation where neither side can trust what they see. That is how wars start by accident. 3:35 in the morning. Evenis Air Base. Inside the control trailer, Miller was fighting to maintain her lock. The 4 inbound Iskander missiles were now 50 miles away. The system was struggling to distinguish between the real warheads and the digital ghosts, Miller reported. I am losing the track on target 4. The ghosts are merging with the primary targets. I have to switch to manual thermal tracking. Vance nodded. Do it, Miller. You have 30 seconds until the next intercept point. The Patriot battery continued its automated cycle. 2 more interceptors launched with a thunderous roar. The 4th and 5th Russian missiles were destroyed 40 miles out. The sky flashed a brilliant white. For a moment, the debris was visible as a shower of sparks against the black clouds. But the 6th, 7th, and 8th missiles remained. The 8th was still orbiting. It was a silent observer in a sky filled with fire. Miller wiped sweat from her forehead. Interceptors 7 and 8 are away, targeting targets 6 and 7. But I still have no solution for target 8. It is not moving like a missile. It is moving like a predator. 3:36 in the morning. Evenis Air Base. The Patriot battery was operating at its mechanical limit. The cooling systems for the radar array were whining under the strain of processing massive amounts of data. Inside the engagement control station, the air was thick with the smell of hot electronics. Captain Sarah Miller did not blink. Her eyes moved between the thermal track and the radar display. Miller spoke to the crew. Interceptors 7 and 8 are in the terminal homing phase. Closing velocity is Mach 9.2. The 2 Patriot missiles were screaming through the thin Arctic air. They were no longer being steered by the ground radar. Their own internal seekers had taken over. They were looking for the heat of the Russian warheads. On the screen, the blue dots were closing the gap with the red triangles. The commander, Colonel Vance, watched the range-to-go timer. 30 seconds to intercept. Miller, give me a status on target 8. Miller adjusted a dial. Target 8 is still in a high-speed orbit. It is maintaining 60,000 feet. It is not attempting to engage the interceptors. It is just watching. Vance gripped the edge of the console. It is acting like a command and control node. It is coordinating the other missiles. 3:37 in the morning. The Kola Peninsula. Captain Volkov stood outside his command vehicle. The air was minus 20 degrees. He could see the distant flashes of the intercepts over the horizon. They looked like silent, artificial stars blooming and dying in the dark. He felt a profound sense of helplessness. His battery had started a war, and he could not stop it. The radio in his pocket crackled. It was the regimental commander. Volkov. We have a direct order from Moscow. If the Americans launch a counterstrike, you are to scuttle the remaining launchers and surrender to the Norwegians. Do not fire back." Volkov responded. "Understood. But the launchers are not responding to my commands. They are still slave to the external uplink. Then use explosives. Destroy the hardware. We cannot allow that signal to continue." Volkov looked at his men. They were holding thermite grenades. They were preparing to destroy their own equipment to save the world from a nuclear exchange. It was a desperate act of sabotage against their own side. 3:38 in the morning. Evenes Air Base. The sky erupted. Two massive concussions rolled over the base, shaking the windows of the hangars. In the control trailer, Miller saw the icons for targets 6 and 7 vanish. Miller shouted, "Confirm 2 more kills. Targets 6 and 7 are destroyed. Debris is falling into the sea." The room cheered for a split second. It was the first time the Patriot system had intercepted a full salvo of Iskander missiles in a combat environment. 7 out of 8 missiles were gone. The base was safe from the primary strike. But the cheers died as the 8th icon moved. Vance pointed at the screen. "It is breaking orbit. Look at the velocity." 3:39 in the morning. Vardo radar station. The technician at Vardo saw the change first. The 8th missile had stopped its circular flight. It had turned 90 degrees in a fraction of a second. It was now diving straight down. It was headed for the center of the Evenes Air Base. The technician spoke into the headset. "Evenes. Target 8 is inbound. Velocity is Mach 12. I repeat, Mach 12. It is doubling its speed." Miller was typing furiously. "I cannot get a lock. The radar is skipping off the target. It is like the missile is not there. It is a hole in the sky." Vance looked at the main monitor. The red icon was moving so fast the computer could not draw a steady line. It was a blur of motion. Miller's voice was a whisper. "It is 5 miles out. 4 miles. 3. The system was supposed to fire the last remaining interceptor automatically, but the computer stayed silent. The ready-to-fire light was dark. The 8th missile was inside the minimum engagement zone. It was seconds from impact. Vance closed his eyes. Brace for impact. The countdown reached 0. 3:40 in the morning. Evenes Air Base. The 8th missile was no longer a ballistic object. It was a spear of white heat. Inside the engagement control station, the air seemed to vibrate with a frequency that bypassed the ears and rattled the teeth. Captain Sarah Miller stared at the screen. The red icon was less than 2 miles from the center of the base. Miller screamed into the internal net, "System override! I am attempting a manual launch." She hammered the override keys. The computer did not respond. The screen was a chaotic mess of shifting code. The weapon was moving at Mach 12. It was traveling at 4,000 meters per second. The time between detection and impact was now less than 1 second. Colonel Vance gripped the metal frame of the console. His knuckles were white. "Miller, where is it?" Miller's voice was a ragged whisper. "It is over the runway. It is right on top of us." 3:40 and 30 seconds in the morning. Vardo radar station. The technician at Vardo watched his main monitor. The massive data stream from the radar array suddenly flattened. It was as if someone had pulled a plug on reality. The signal did not fade. It did not experience interference. It simply ceased to exist. The technician looked at his supervisor. "Sir, everything is gone. I have lost the base. I have lost the missile. I have lost the entire sector." The supervisor checked his secondary feeds. "Check the optical sensors. Is there a flash? Give me an infrared reading from the satellite." "Negative. No thermal bloom. No blast signature." The satellite sees the base. It is still there. But the radar says the base is empty space. 3:41 in the morning. Severomorsk, Russia. Admiral Gorshkov stood in absolute silence. The tactical map on the wall of the Fleet Command Center had turned entirely black. The icons for the Norwegian base, the American ships in the Barents Sea, and his own missile battery had vanished. The communications officer was shaking. "Admiral, all satellite links have been severed. We are blind. Every sensor on the Kola Peninsula is reporting zero data. Gorshkov looked at the clock. The missile should have hit 30 seconds ago. If it had a nuclear warhead, the electromagnetic pulse would explain the sensor failure. But there was no seismic data. There was no flash. Gorshkov spoke softly. It is not a war. It is an erasure. 3:41 and 15 seconds in the morning. Evenes Air Base. Inside the control trailer, the lights flickered and died. The hum of the cooling fans stopped. The darkness was absolute. The soldiers held their breath, waiting for the shockwave that would end their lives. They waited for the heat. They waited for the sound of the world tearing apart. Miller could hear her own heartbeat. It was loud in the sudden silence. She reached out in the dark, touching the cold glass of her monitor. She expected to feel the vibration of an explosion. Instead, she felt nothing. The air was perfectly still. The smell of ozone had vanished, replaced by the crisp, cold scent of the Arctic night. 3:42 in the morning. Evenes Air Base. The emergency lights in the Patriot control trailer flickered once. Then they buzzed into a steady, artificial hum. Captain Sarah Miller opened her eyes. She was still sitting in her chair. Her hands were still gripping the edge of the console. She looked at Colonel Vance. He was staring at the main display. The screen was no longer black. It was alive with data, but the data was wrong. Vance found his voice. Miller, report. Did we take a hit? Miller shook her head slowly. She looked at the internal diagnostics. Negative. No structural damage detected. No seismic activity. No radiation. She looked at the tactical map. The red icon for Target 8 was gone. In its place was a single, steady blue circle. It was hovering directly over the center of the runway. Miller whispered, "Sir, the target has stopped." Vance leaned in. "Stopped? You mean it crashed?" "No. It is at 0 knots. Altitude is 42 feet. It is hovering over the tarmac. 3:42 and 30 seconds in the morning." Vardo Radar Station. The supervisor at Vardo was shouting at his technicians. The radar screens had suddenly flooded with the most crystalline signal he had ever seen in his career. The atmospheric clutter was gone. The electronic noise from the Russian jamming had vanished. The radar was showing the Evenes Air Base with a resolution that should have been physically impossible. The technician pointed at the center of the screen. "Sir, look at the return. It is not a missile. It is not metal." The supervisor adjusted the magnification. On the high-resolution feed, the object over the runway did not have a radar cross-section. It was a perfect sphere of void. It was a hole in the radio waves. The technician spoke. "It is drawing power from the environment. I am seeing a massive energy drain from the local grid. It is not just hovering, it is feeding." 3:43 in the morning. The Pentagon. Washington. General Thorne watched the live satellite feed. The infrared camera was showing a bright white dot in the middle of the Norwegian base. It was not a fire. The temperature was exactly 0 degrees Celsius. It was a thermal neutral point. The National Security Advisor looked at the image. "What am I looking at? Is that a Russian weapon?" Thorne shook his head. "The Russians are calling us again." The Russian translator came back on the line. "General Thorne, Admiral Gorshkov is reporting the same phenomenon. At the launch site, the Iskander battery has been encased in a field of static. The soldiers cannot get within 50 meters of the launchers. They are frozen in time." Thorne looked at the clock. 1 minute ago, they were on the verge of a nuclear war. Now, both sides were staring at something that had rewritten the rules of engagement. 3:43 and 45 seconds in the morning. Evenes Air Base. Miller stood up from her station. She walked to the heavy steel door of the control trailer and pushed it open. The cold Arctic air hit her face. It was silent. The sirens had stopped. The wind had died down. She looked toward the runway. A few hundred meters away, a sphere of soft, shimmering light was floating just above the asphalt. It was the size of a small car. It did not move. It did not make a sound. The snow around it was not melting. It was floating in the air, caught in a gravitational field that ignored the Earth. Vance stepped out behind her. He saw the object. He saw the way the light seemed to bend around it, distorting the hangars and the mountains in the distance. Vance spoke into his radio. Security teams. This is the commander. Hold your fire. Do not approach the runway. I repeat, do not engage. The sphere suddenly pulsed. A ripple of translucent energy moved outward. It passed through the buildings. It passed through the soldiers. It passed through the Patriot launchers. Miller felt a strange sensation in her chest. It was not pain. It was a feeling of profound clarity. For a second, she felt like she could see every star in the sky, even through the clouds. Then, the sphere began to rise. It did not accelerate. It simply moved upward, defying the weight of the world. 3:44 in the morning. Evans Air Base. The sphere of light was now 500 meters above the runway. It was ascending at a perfectly constant rate. It did not flicker. It did not leave a trail of exhaust. Inside the engagement control station, the primary radar displays were beginning to reboot. The flickering code was gone. In its place was a diagnostic report that made no sense. Captain Sarah Miller watched the power levels on her screen. The Patriot battery was showing 100% charge, but the external power grid for the entire county was still dark. The system was running on an energy source that it could not identify. Miller spoke to Colonel Vance. "Sir, the battery is fully powered, but we are disconnected from the generators. It is like the air itself is holding a charge." Vance was looking out the open door. The sphere was now a small, bright star against the dark clouds. "Can we track it?" Miller turned back to her console. "Negative. The radar sees the space where it is, but it returns a value of 0. It is a perfect vacuum. Our sensors are bypassing the object entirely." 3:46 in the morning. The Kola Peninsula. Captain Volkov was kneeling in the snow, 200 meters from his Iskander launchers. He was breathing hard. The air near the vehicles was vibrating with a low, melodic hum. It was not the sound of an engine. It was the sound of a tuning fork. Volkov spoke into his radio. "Regiment, I attempted to approach Launcher 1. At 50 meters, the air became thick. It felt like walking into deep water. I could not move my legs forward. There is a physical barrier, but it is invisible." The regimental commander responded. "Is there any heat? Any radiation?" "Negative. It is cold. But the snow is not touching the launchers. It is stopping mid-air and sliding around them, like they are inside a glass bubble." Volkov looked at his hands. The hair on his arms was standing up. Every piece of metal on his uniform was glowing with a faint blue static. He was not afraid. He felt a strange sense of peace that was entirely out of place on a battlefield. 3:48 in the morning. The Kremlin. Moscow. The Russian president sat in a small, windowless room deep beneath the city. On the secure video link, the American president looked equally exhausted. The two men had spent the last 20 minutes confirming what their generals already knew. Neither side had ordered the launch. Neither side had the technology to stop the world in its tracks. The Russian president spoke through a translator. "We have lost total control of our strategic assets in the north. Our technicians say the encryption has been rewritten. It is not a virus. It is a new architecture." The American president nodded. "We are seeing the same thing in Norway. Our Patriot systems are active, but they are not responding to our codes. Something has stepped between our two armies. What are your intentions for the fleet in the Barents Sea? I have ordered them to back off 50 miles. We are not looking for a fight. We are looking for an explanation." The Russian president leaned forward. "If this is an intervention, it is the most sophisticated act of electronic warfare in human history. Or it is something else entirely." 3:50 in the morning. Evenes Air Base. The sphere had reached 12,000 feet. It stopped its ascent as suddenly as it had begun. On the horizon, the first faint hint of the Arctic dawn was beginning to gray the sky. The light from the sphere changed. It shifted from white to a deep, pulsing violet. Miller called out from the trailer. "Sir, the object is broadcasting." Vance ran back inside. "Is it a radio signal?" It is a wide-spectrum transmission. It is hitting every frequency, from low-band radio to high-frequency gamma rays. It is a burst of data. It is repeating every 10 seconds. Miller hit a key to play the audio translation of the radio band. The speakers filled the small room with a series of rhythmic pulses. It sounded like a heartbeat. But beneath the rhythm, there was a complex series of tones. Miller looked at the waveform. It is not a language. It is math. It is math. It is a series of prime numbers followed by coordinates. Vance looked at the coordinates on the bottom of the screen. Vance looked at the coordinates on the bottom of the screen. His heart skipped. Those are not coordinates for the base. Miller whispered, "No, sir. Those are coordinates for every nuclear silo in the Northern Hemisphere." 3:51 in the morning. The Pentagon, Washington. The large digital map in the National Military Command Center began to change. Tiny white dots were appearing across the entire Northern Hemisphere. They were clustered in the plains of North Dakota. They were scattered across the forests of Siberia. They were deep in the mountains of China. General Thorne stood with his hands on the back of his chair. He did not need a briefing to know what those dots represented. They were the precise locations of every active intercontinental ballistic missile silo on the planet. Thorne spoke to his intelligence chief. "Is that our data? Is the system pulling from our targeting database?" The chief shook his head. His face was gray. "No, sir. The system is receiving this data from the broadcast in Norway. It is an external feed. It is pinpointing locations we have spent decades trying to hide. And it is pinpointing locations the Russians have kept secret since the Cold War." The National Security Advisor gripped the edge of the table. "It is a map of our vulnerability. If that sphere is a weapon, it is just locked onto every nuclear asset we own." Thorne looked at the screen. "It is not a lock. Look at the status indicators." Next to each white dot, a new symbol appeared. It was a simple, horizontal line. In the logic of the mysterious transmission, the meaning was clear. The silos were being taken offline. 4 o'clock in the morning, Moscow, Russia. Inside the Kremlin bunker, the Russian president watched a similar display. The dead hand system, designed to launch a retaliatory strike even if the leadership was destroyed, was showing a series of critical failures. One by one, the nuclear regiments in the interior were reporting that their launch codes had been scrambled. The president turned to his military advisor. "Can we override? Use the physical keys." The advisor looked at his tablet. The hardware is unresponsive. The electronic locks have been fused. It is as if the atoms of the circuit boards have been rearranged. We no longer have a nuclear deterrent. The president leaned back. The weight of his power had vanished in less than an hour. And the Americans? Their silos are reporting the same status. The world has been disarmed by a single radio burst. 4:10 in the morning, Evanes Air Base. Outside the control trailer, the air had become unnaturally warm. The snow that had been falling earlier was gone. It had not melted. It had simply evaporated. Captain Sarah Miller walked toward the edge of the runway. She looked up at the violet star hanging in the sky. Miller spoke into her radio. "Colonel, the background radiation is dropping. It is lower than the natural levels of the Earth. The sphere is cleaning the environment." Colonel Vance walked out to join her. He was no longer wearing his helmet. He looked tired, but he was no longer afraid. "What do the prime numbers mean, Miller? Why the math?" Miller looked at the tablet in her hand. The sequence was still scrolling. It is a universal greeting. It is the only way to say, "We are here," without using a language that can be misunderstood. It is the language of logic. Vance looked at the Patriot launchers. Their missiles were still inside the canisters. They were the most advanced defensive weapons in the American arsenal. Now, they looked like primitive toys. Vance sighed. They stopped a war. Our own weapons were going to destroy us, and this thing just stepped in. 4:15 in the morning. The Barents Sea. A United States Navy destroyer, the USS Carney, was cruising 50 miles off the coast. On the bridge, the captain watched the horizon. The Russian fleet was visible on the radar, but they were moving away. Both sides were retreating. There was no longer anything to fight over. The high-tech sensors that had once tracked enemy movements were now focused on the sky. The captain spoke to his executive officer. "The world just got very small. didn't it?" The officer nodded. "Yes, sir. And we are no longer the ones in charge of it." The violet light from the sphere began to pulse faster. The rhythm of the prime numbers increased. The broadcast was reaching its conclusion. 4:16 in the morning, Evenes Air Base. The violet pulse from the sphere reached a final, blinding crescendo. For one heartbeat, the entire valley was illuminated in a color that had no name in the human spectrum. Then, the light vanished. It did not fade or shrink. It simply ceased to be. The air, which had been vibrating with high-frequency energy, suddenly went flat and still. The primary power grid for the base surged back to life. In the control trailer, the monitors flashed from their emergency diagnostics back to the standard NATO operational screens. The hum of the cooling fans returned to its familiar, mechanical drone. Captain Sarah Miller sat back in her chair. She felt a sudden, crushing weight of exhaustion. Miller spoke into the internal net. Her voice was thin. "Sir, the contact is gone. All sensor tracks have terminated. The sky is clear." Colonel Vance stepped out of the trailer and onto the metal stairs. He looked up at the spot where the sphere had been. There was nothing but the fading stars and the first gray light of the Arctic dawn. The silence was absolute. It was the silence of a world that had almost ended and did not know how to begin again. Vance clicked his radio. "All units, stand down, return to your stations. Medical teams, check for casualties. Engineering, I want a full damage assessment of the runway. Now, 5 o'clock in the morning, the Barents Sea coast." The sun began to crawl over the jagged peaks of the Lofoten Islands. The light was cold and pale. A Norwegian search and rescue helicopter, call sign Raven 41, drifted over the black water of the bay. The crew was looking for the remains of the 7 intercepted missiles. The pilot spoke to the base. "Control, Raven 41, I have visual. On debris field Alpha. We see multiple pieces of scorched metal on the ice shelf. It looks like the motor sections of the first 3 Iskanders." The controller responded. "Copy, Raven 41. Mark the coordinates. Do not attempt recovery. A specialized technical team is inbound." In Russia, the scene was identical. Captain Volkov stood by his launchers. The invisible barrier was gone. The snow was falling normally again, dusting the green metal of the vehicles. The launchers were cold. The digital displays inside the command cabin were dead. Every byte of targeting data, every line of launch code, had been wiped from the hard drives. It was as if the battery had never been commissioned. 6 o'clock in the morning, Evans Air Base. Miller and Vance walked onto the tarmac of the primary runway. They were followed by a team of technicians carrying chemical sniffer dogs and ground-penetrating radar. They reached the exact center of the base, the spot where the 8th missile had reached 0 altitude. The lead technician stopped. He looked at his handheld sensor. Then he looked at the ground. He shook his head. "Colonel, there is nothing here." Vance looked at the asphalt. "What do you mean?" "Nothing. There has to be shrapnel. There has to be a heat signature from the Mach 12 descent." The technician knelt and ran his gloved hand over the runway. "The surface temperature is exactly 32 degrees Fahrenheit. There is no carbon scoring. There is no kinetic displacement. The radar says the ground is solid, but according to the sensors, nothing ever touched this spot." Miller looked at her own tablet. She was comparing the radar logs from Vardo with the physical reality of the runway. The 8th missile performed a terminal maneuver that should have leveled every building within a mile. It was right here. We all saw it. Vance looked toward the mountains. The wreckage of the other 7 missiles was being hauled away by heavy cranes in the distance. Those were real. They were made of steel and high explosives. They represented the peak of human destructive power. Vance spoke softly. "The 7 missiles were our problem. The 8th one was theirs." Miller looked at him. "Theirs, sir? Whoever sent that sphere. They intercepted the 7 we could handle, but they erased the one we could not. They did not just stop a missile, Miller. They edited it out of existence. The morning sun finally hit the runway, turning the frost into a million tiny diamonds. The crisis was over. The technical investigation was just beginning. 3 days later, 10 in the morning. The Pentagon. General Thorne sat in a windowless briefing room with 12 of the top physicists and electronic warfare experts in the United States. The air was heavy with the smell of stale coffee and the hum of high-end server racks. On the main screen, a looped video played. It was the infrared footage from the Evenes Air Base. It showed the 8th missile entering its terminal dive, then simply becoming a hole in the thermal spectrum. Thorne tapped a pen on the table. I still do not understand what happened to the 8th warhead. Give it to me in plain English. A senior analyst from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency stood up. He looked like he had not slept in 72 hours. General, we analyzed the code that was broadcast during the final pulse. It was not a virus. It was a complete rewrite of the operating system of the Patriot battery. And from what the Russians are telling us, the same thing happened to their Iskander launchers. Thorne leaned forward. A rewrite? In how much time? 6 milliseconds. For context, it takes a human eye 300 milliseconds to blink. This entity, or whatever it was, analyzed our most secure encryption and replaced it with a superior architecture in the time it takes a computer to process a single bit of data. The analyst clicked a button, showing a map of the world. Furthermore, the disarmament pulse was universal. We have confirmed that. Every Minuteman III silo in the American Midwest is currently unresponsive to our launch commands. The physical locks are intact. The hardware is powered, but the software is locked behind a mathematical wall we cannot climb. Thorne looked at the map. And the Russians? The Chinese? The French? Every nuclear power is in the same position. The world has been put in a digital straitjacket. We still have our conventional forces. We still have our tanks and our ships. But the nuclear age ended 3 days ago, at 3:51 in the morning. 3 days later, 2 in the afternoon. Moscow. Captain Ivan Volkov sat in a small, sterile interrogation room at the headquarters of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. He was no longer wearing his uniform. He looked at the 2 officers across from him. They had been asking the same questions for 18 hours. The lead interrogator leaned in. Captain, tell us again, who entered the launch sequence? Volkov's voice was hoarse. No one. I was looking at the consoles. The keys did not turn. The panels were locked. The command did not come from the regiment. It did not come from the admiral. The system woke up on its own. It was like the launchers were talking to each other. The interrogator slammed a folder on the table. Systems do not talk to each other. Volkov, they are machines. Volkov shook his head. Not anymore. When the first missile launched, I felt the vibration. There was no sound, no heat. It was like the physics of the engine had been changed. We are looking for a human traitor, because we are afraid to look at the truth. And what is the truth, Captain? Volkov looked at the camera in the corner of the room. He spoke directly to whoever was watching behind the glass. The truth is that we were about to burn the world. We had the missiles fueled. We had the targets locked. We were ready to kill millions for a border dispute that no one will remember in 1,000 years. Something decided that we are no longer allowed to play with those toys. The interrogator stood up and walked out, without a word. Outside in the hallway, Admiral Gorshkov was waiting. He looked at the lead interrogator. Does he know anything else? The officer shook his head. He is telling the truth, Admiral. Our technical teams have confirmed his story. The Iskander battery was not hacked by the Americans. It was seized by an external source that operates on a frequency we cannot even detect. Gorshkov looked out the window, toward the Kremlin. The city was bustling. People were going to work. They were buying groceries. They had no idea how close they had come to the end. They had no idea that their safety was now being managed by a ghost. Gorshkov spoke softly. The Americans are calling this the silent peace. They think we should be grateful. The officer looked at him. Are you? Sir? I am a soldier. I spent 40 years learning how to fight a nuclear war. Now, I am obsolete. We are all obsolete. 4 days later, 8 in the morning, Evenes Air Base. The base was back to a state of high readiness, but the tension had changed. It was no longer the tension of a hunter, it was the tension of a bird watching the sky for a hawk. Captain Sarah Miller stood on the runway where the 8th missile had hovered. The asphalt was smooth. There was no sign that anything had ever happened. Colonel Vance walked up to her. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one. Strategic Command says the silos are still dark. No change. Miller took a sip of the coffee. It was hot and bitter. They are not dark, sir. They are protected. That is what the analysts are saying now. We did not lose our weapons. We were relieved of them. Vance looked at the sky. It was a deep, empty blue. It is a strange feeling, knowing we are being watched. The morning was quiet. The investigation was ongoing. The world was at peace. But it was a peace that felt like a trial. 14 days after the event, the Norwegian Ministry of Defense in Oslo, the conference room was filled with military attaches from 20 nations. They sat in a heavy, contemplative silence. On the primary screen, a single image was displayed. It was a global map of the Northern Hemisphere. Every nuclear silo, every submarine base, and every bomber wing was highlighted in a steady, neutral green light. The icons were not blinking. They were not active. They were archived. A senior NATO analyst stood at the podium. He did not use a laser pointer. He did not use a script. He spoke with the voice of a man who had accepted a new and uncomfortable reality. The analyst addressed the room. Gentlemen, we have spent 70 years perfecting the art of the nuclear deterrent. We built a world on the foundation of mutual assured destruction. In less than 1 hour, that foundation was removed. We are no longer the primary actors in our own security. An American general spoke from the front row. Has there been any change in the status of the silos? The analyst shook his head. Negative. The mathematical lock remains in place. Our most advanced supercomputers have tried to crack the first line of the code. They estimate it would take 3,000 years to find the first key. The same report is coming from Moscow and Beijing. The nuclear age did not end with a bang or a whimper. It was simply turned off. 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Severomorsk, Russia. Admiral Gorshkov stood on the pier of the Northern Fleet headquarters. Behind him, the massive hull of a Bore-class submarine sat low in the water. The vessel was a marvel of Russian engineering, capable of carrying 16 ballistic missiles. Now, it was a multi-billion-dollar museum piece. The crew was on deck, performing routine maintenance that felt like a performance for a ghost. Gorshkov spoke to his chief of staff. The Americans are calling this the Great Intervention. What are our sailors calling it? The officer looked out at the gray, choppy water of the Barents Sea. The silence, Admiral. They are calling it the silence. They say the ocean feels empty now, like the predators have all been caged. Gorshkov sighed. It is a strange kind of peace. We have the men, we have the steel, but we no longer have the permission to use them. 7:15 in the evening. Evenes Air Base, Norway. The base was winding down for the night. The frantic pace of the investigation had slowed to a steady, bureaucratic crawl. Captain Sarah Miller sat on the tailboard of a transport truck near the edge of the runway. She watched the sun dip below the mountains, painting the sky in streaks of fire and violet. Colonel Vance walked up to her, holding 2 folders. He leaned against the truck. The rotation orders are in. Miller, we are heading back to the United States on Thursday. The Patriot battery is being replaced by a standard short-range defense unit. Miller looked at the spot on the runway where the sphere had hovered. Because the ballistic threat is gone? Vance nodded. Because the threat is being managed by a higher authority. Our presence here is symbolic now. We are just park rangers in a sanctuary we do not own. Miller took a deep breath of the cold air. Do you think they are still there, sir? Watching? Vance looked up at the stars as they began to blink into existence. I think they never left. I think we just stopped being loud enough for them to ignore. The strategic assessment of the unidentified aerial phenomenon would continue for decades. Historians would argue about whether humanity was saved or enslaved. Military experts would study the sensor hole and the mathematical wall until their hair turned white. But the soldiers who were there knew the truth. Modern warfare had entered the era of the black box. The most advanced weapons on the planet were now subject to a veto that no general could override. The world was still a dangerous place, filled with old rivalries and ancient grudges. But the ceiling for human violence had been lowered by an invisible hand. The morning in the Arctic had redefined the meaning of power. It was no longer about who could destroy the most. It was about who could exist within the limits of a peace they did not choose. The missiles were still in their silos. The submarines were still in the deep, but the triggers were gone. The sky over Norway was clear and dark. Somewhere in the vast, cold distance, the prime numbers were still repeating. The message was simple. The world was under observation, and the observers were not finished.